You know, the first 40 years are for building. The next 40, if you're lucky, are for enjoying what you built. At 68, I figured I was well into the second part. My hands, which had spent 4 decades covered in grease, grime, and the honest sweat of hard labor, were finally clean. Most days, anyway. Sometimes I'd still find myself in the garage tinkering with my old '69 Mustang, and the familiar smell of oil and metal would feel more like home than the filtered air in my house. For 40 years, I owned Hank's Honest Auto. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. In a business full of sharks, I was the guy you could trust. I fixed what was broken, charged what was fair, and I remembered every customer's name and usually the names of their kids, too. I built that shop from a 2-bay garage with a leaky roof into the most respected auto body institution in this town. My work wasn't just about denting out fenders or replacing bumpers. It was about restoring peace of mind. It was about getting a family back on the road after a scare, making a teenager's first clunker safe, and keeping the work trucks that built this town running smoothly. My reputation was my retirement plan, or so I thought. The actual money part of the plan, well, that was something else entirely. I wasn't a flashy man, but I was a careful one. Every dollar I saved went into a diversified portfolio, managed by a kid half my age who was twice as smart as me about the market. I lived simply, so I could retire comfortably. The trouble started about a year after I hung up my coveralls for good. A plot of land directly across the street, which had been a derelict laundromat for as long as I could remember, was suddenly cleared. In its place, a structure rose from the earth with terrifying speed. It was all glass and gleaming chrome, lit up at night like a spaceship had landed in our quiet part of town. The sign went up a week later, in bold, aggressive blue and silver letters, Prestige Auto, the future of automotive care. The future, it turned out, was run by a kid who couldn't have been more than 30. His name was Chase, and he had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore tailored suits without a tie, shoes that cost more than my first car, and an air of supreme, unshakable confidence that only comes from never having faced a real consequence in your life. He drove a different luxury car to work every week, each one looking like it had just rolled off a showroom floor, pristine and untouched by the realities of the road. My old shop, which I still owned the property of, sat across from his new empire, looking humble and solid, and I had to admit, a little tired. I'd leased it to a young fella who ran a small custom decal business. It was quiet, paid the rent, and kept the lights on. Chase saw my old building not as a piece of this town's history, but as an obstacle, a blemish on his perfect chrome-plated view. About a month after he opened, he strutted across the street, his expensive shoes clicking on the asphalt I'd patched myself a dozen times over the years. He didn't introduce himself, he just started talking. He gestured at my old shop with a dismissive wave of his hand. He said, "I'm planning a major expansion. Phase 2. We need more service bays, a state-of-the-art detailing center. Your little building here is prime real estate." My little building, the place where I'd poured my life's blood, sweat, and tears. He made it sound like a garden shed. He offered me a check right then and there. It was a decent number, I'll give him that, but it was the way he did it, like he was doing me a favor, like he was a king, bestowing a pouch of gold upon a peasant. I told him, politely, that the property wasn't for sale. I had a tenant, and I was happy with the arrangement. He just laughed. A short, sharp barking sound. He said, "Don't be sentimental, old-timer. Everything has a price. Let me know when you want to get serious." He called me an old-timer. He didn't know my name. Didn't care to. In his eyes, I was already a ghost, a relic from a bygone era, a fossil. He even used that word a few weeks later in a local newspaper interview about his disruptive business model. He talked about clearing out the fossils to make way for progress. He was talking about me, about my life's work. That was the first real sting, the first time the quiet satisfaction of my retirement soured in my mouth. It was a betrayal not just to me, but to the very idea of what my shop stood for: respect, history, and honest work. He wasn't just building a business, he was trying to erase one, and that was something I couldn't let stand. The anger didn't hit me like a lightning bolt. It was more like a slow-burning coal in the pit of my stomach. For the first few weeks, I tried to ignore it. I'd walk the dog on a different route to avoid seeing his palace of chrome. I'd change the channel when one of his slick, obnoxious commercials came on the local TV station, featuring smiling actors who looked like they'd never had a speck of dirt under their fingernails. But his presence was unavoidable. He was the talk of the town, for better or worse. Some people were dazzled by the fancy waiting room with its espresso machine and leather couches. Others, the ones who knew better, would shake their heads. I'd run into old customers at the grocery store or the post office. People like Mrs. Gable, a sweet old lady whose '98 Buick I'd kept on the road for 15 years past its expiration date. She'd cornered me by the produce section, her eyes wide with distress. She said, "Hank, you won't believe what they tried to charge me at that new place. Prestige Auto." My check engine light came on, just a loose gas cap like you taught me to check, but they told me I needed a whole new catalytic converter. $1,500. I just drove away. I went home and tightened the cap, and the light went out the next day. Can you believe the nerve? I could believe it. I'd seen his kind before. All flash, no substance. They sell you the sizzle, but the steak is rotten. I heard more and more stories like that. A young kid, Billy Jensen's boy, went in for a simple oil change and came out with a $4,000 estimate for a critical transmission fluid flush and preventative suspension replacement on a car with 30,000 miles on it. It was predatory. It was dishonest. It was everything my shop had stood against. Each story was another shovelful of coal on the fire in my gut. This wasn't just about him insulting me. It was about him preying on my town, on the very people I had spent my life serving. He was poisoning the well. The fallout in my own mind was a storm. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings, the porch I'd built with my own two hands, and stare across the street at his glowing monument to greed. I felt obsolete. It's a terrible feeling to realize the world might not have a place for you anymore. To see the things you valued, honesty, craftsmanship, a man's word, be treated as quaint, old-fashioned notions. I'd have flashbacks, not of war or trauma, but of work. I'd remember the smell of Bondo dust in the air, the satisfying thud of a door aligning perfectly, the look of relief on a customer's face when I told them the fix was simpler and cheaper than they'd feared. I remembered one winter, a blizzard hit us hard. A young woman, a nurse on her way to the hospital, slid off the road and crumpled her fender. She was in tears, not about the car, but about missing her shift. I towed her car to the shop myself, banged out the dent well enough to make it drivable, and topped off her fluids. I told her, "Just get to work. We'll worry about the bill later." She tried to pay me, but I just waved her off. "Your job is more important right now," I said. A week later, she came back with a check and a box of the best donuts I've ever tasted. Her name was Sarah. She and her husband became customers for life. They sent me Christmas cards for 20 years. You don't build that kind of loyalty with an espresso machine. You build it with trust. You build it with character. And then there was the day I retired. I didn't sell the business, just the name and the client list, to a decent mechanic who ran it for a few years, before moving to be closer to his grandkids. When I handed him the keys, the weight of them felt immense. It was 40 years of early mornings and late nights, of busted knuckles and aching backs. It was the tool that had put my kids through college, paid for this house, and built my life. My son Mark had come for the occasion. He'd helped me clean out my old office. He picked up a framed photo from my desk. It was me, 20-something years old, grinning like a fool in front of the original two-bay garage, holding a sign I'd painted myself. Hank's Auto. My son looked at me and said, "Dad, you built something real here, something that mattered." Chase's gaudy dealership felt like a personal affront to that memory, to that reality. He wasn't building anything real. He was building a facade, a flimsy Hollywood set designed to separate people from their money as efficiently as possible. And he was trying to bulldoze my history to do it. The personal attacks kept coming. He started leaving flyers on the windshields of cars in my neighborhood. "Is your old ride a fossil? Trade up to the prestige experience." He was relentless. He'd see me out mowing my lawn and shout across the street, "Hey Hank, I've got a new offer for you. Higher this time." He treated it like a game, a joke. The breaking point, the real catalyst, came about 2 months into this nightmare. The young man I leased my old shop to, the decal artist, his name was Leo. He was a good kid, quiet and hard-working. He called me one afternoon, his voice shaking. He said, "Hank, you need to come down here." When I arrived, I saw Chase and 2 other men in suits standing on the sidewalk in front of my property. They were from the city planning department. Chase was pointing at my building, talking animatedly about code violations. He'd filed a series of anonymous complaints. An old unused ventilation hood from when it was a full-service shop was supposedly a fire hazard. The wiring, which was perfectly safe but not up to the 2023 code for new construction, was a public danger. The faded paint was a civic eyesore. He was trying to use the city to condemn my building, to force my hand. He saw me and gave me that smug reptilian smile. He said, "Just business, Hank. Progress. Your building is a dinosaur. It's dragging down the property values." My property values, he meant. I looked at Leo, who looked like he was about to be sick. I looked at the city officials, who had the uncomfortable look of people who knew they were being used as pawns. And I looked at Chase, with his perfect hair and his soulless eyes. The slow-burning coal in my stomach erupted into a furnace. The anger was no longer hot and messy. It became cold. It became clear. It became resolved. He thought I was a fossil. He thought because I was old, I was weak. Because I was quiet, I was powerless. He saw an old man with a sentimental attachment to a crumbling building. He didn't see the man who had built that building into an institution. He didn't see the man who had outlasted dozens of competitors over 40 years by being smarter, tougher, and more patient than all of them. He had made a classic mistake. He had underestimated his opponent. I smiled back at him, a real smile this time, though it probably looked a little grim. I said, "Don't you worry about my building, son. I'll handle it." I turned and walked away, but I wasn't retreating. I was advancing. The war had begun. He just didn't know it yet. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. It was about defending my legacy. But standing there watching him try to weaponize the city against me, watching him try to bully a good young man like Leo out of his livelihood, well, that's when it became about revenge, too. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, the one room in the house that still felt like a command center. Books on engineering and mechanics lined one wall. Financial ledgers from the old shop filled a filing cabinet. This was where I did my thinking. And for the first time in a long time, I had something to think about that wasn't my golf swing or what to plant in the garden next spring. My mind was racing. My first instinct was to fight him on his own turf, hire a lawyer, challenge the code violations, drag him through a public battle. But that's what he wanted. A messy public fight where he could paint me as a stubborn old man blocking progress. It would be a war of attrition, and he had deeper pockets for that kind of fight. Or so he thought. No, a direct assault was a fool's game. The best mechanics know you don't just hammer a dent from the outside. You get behind it, find the hidden point of weakness, and apply pressure from the inside out. You use your opponent's own structure against him. I needed to know more about Prestige Auto, not the flashy showroom, but the bones of the operation. The money. Every empire, no matter how grand, has a foundation, and I had a sneaking suspicion his was built on sand. The next morning I called Salvatore Romano. Sal had been my accountant for 35 years. He was a small, neat man, with glasses perpetually perched on the end of his nose and a mind like a steel trap. He'd retired a few years before I did, claiming his wife wanted him to learn how to relax. He'd failed spectacularly at it. He spent most of his days managing a fantasy baseball league with the intensity of a Wall Street trader and auditing the books of his local church for fun. If anyone could help me look under the hood of Chase's financial engine, it was Sal. We met at our usual spot, a little diner called the Corner Booth that served coffee that could strip paint. I laid it all out for him. Chase, the insults, the expansion plans, the attempt to use the city against me. Sal listened patiently, stirring his coffee, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he took a long sip and set his cup down with a soft click. He said, "Hank, the kid's a piranha. You're a trout. You're not built for the same water. Let him have the building. What do you care? You're retired. Go to Florida." I shook my head. "It's not about the building anymore, Sal. It's about the principle." He called me a fossil. He's running a crooked shop and making a mockery of everything we built. I can't just let that go. Sal sighed, the sigh of a man who knew he was about to be dragged into something complicated. He said, "So what's your plan? Fight him in court?" I saw his point. It was a losing proposition. I said, "No, I'm not going to fight him. I'm going to buy him." Sal choked on his coffee. He actually coughed and sputtered, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He stared at me like I'd just announced I was going to build a rocket to the moon. He said, "Buy him. Hank, have you seen that place? It must have cost $10 million to build. Your retirement fund is healthy. But it's not buy a $10 million dealership's healthy. You've gone nuts." "That's what he thinks," I said, leaning forward. "He thinks he's an independent king of this little hill. But he's not. That sign, Prestige Auto, it's a franchise. I did a little digging last night. He's just the local franchisee. The real power, the money, it all comes from a parent company, a publicly traded corporation called Apex Automotive Group." Sal's eyes, which had been full of alarm, suddenly sharpened with interest. The accountant in him was waking up. He took off his glasses, polished them, and put them back on. "Apex Automotive," he murmured. "I've heard of them. They expanded too fast over the last 5 years, bought up a lot of smaller chains, took on a mountain of debt to do it. The whisper on the street is that they're over-leveraged. Their last few quarterly reports have been disappointing." "Exactly," I said. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my wallet. It was a stock chart I'd printed out. I slid it across the table. It looked like a black ski slope. "Their stock has been in a nosedive for the last 18 months. It's trading at pennies on the dollar, compared to its peak." Sal stared at the chart, a slow smile spreading across his face. He was seeing it. The internal weakness, the crack in the foundation. He said, "A falling knife, Hank. Trying to catch a falling knife is a good way to lose a hand." Or I countered, "It's a good way to pick up a whole lot of knives for cheap if you've got a thick enough glove." "Sal, this kid, Chase, he's all arrogance. He thinks his little corner of the world is all that matters. I'll bet you $100 he doesn't even pay attention to the parent company's stock. He's too busy admiring his own reflection in the chrome. What if someone started buying up that cheap stock? Quietly, consistently, through a vehicle that couldn't be traced back to me? What if a fossil, an old retired mechanic from a small town, started accumulating a significant position in this national company?" The plan began to take shape right there in that greasy spoon diner. Sal, his initial skepticism replaced by the thrill of a complex problem, started sketching on a napkin. "We'd need a shell corporation, an anonymous LLC, something bland and untraceable. We settled on H&S Holdings for Hank and Sal. It was a little sentimental, but it was our secret. Sal knew a corporate lawyer in the city who specialized in this sort of thing, a guy who valued discretion and charged a fortune for it. He made the call that afternoon. Then came the research. My nights were no longer filled with restless anger, but with focused purpose. My study became a war room. Sal and I would be on the phone for hours, or he'd come over with a briefcase full of printouts. We dissected Apex Automotive's financial statements. We read every analyst report, every industry blog post, every disgruntled employee review we could find online. The picture that emerged was exactly what we'd suspected. Apex was a house of cards. They had massive debt coming due. Their business model, based on high-pressure sales and overpriced, unnecessary services, was leading to terrible customer retention. Franchisees like Chase were propping up the numbers in the short term, but the foundation was rotting from the inside out. They were vulnerable, deeply vulnerable. While we planned, I needed more information from the inside, and that's where Maria came in. Maria Sanchez had been one of my best detailers for almost a decade. She had an artist's eye when she was done with a car. It didn't just look clean, it looked new. She'd left my shop when it closed down, and to my surprise had taken a job at Prestige Auto. I figured she needed the work. I'd see her sometimes on her smoke break, looking tired and unhappy. One afternoon, I accidentally ran into her at the grocery store. I asked her how things were going at the new place. Her face clouded over. She looked around before speaking, as if Chase might have spies among the canned goods. She said, It's a job, Hank, but it's not like the old place. It's all about the numbers. How many premium wax packages we can sell. How many interior sanitation treatments we can push on people who don't need them. Chase is always on us. He calls the mechanics grease monkeys and the detailers the cleaning crew. There's no respect. Last week he fired old Tom Peterson. You remember Tom, best transmission guy in the state. Fired him because he told a customer they didn't need a full rebuild, that it was just a faulty sensor. Chase said he cost the company $5,000. He said Tom didn't have the killer instinct. Her words were like gold. They confirmed everything. The culture was toxic. The business was rotten to the core. Tom Peterson was a legend. Firing him wasn't just stupid, it was sacrilege. Maria became my unwitting source. I'd make a point of shopping at the same time as her, asking about her family, and she'd vent. She told me about the high employee turnover, the cheap materials they used for repairs while charging for premium parts, the constant customer complaints that were either ignored or settled with non-disclosure agreements. Each piece of information was another reason to push forward, another confirmation that my risky plan wasn't just about my own pride. It was about cleaning up a mess, with the LLC formed, and a brokerage account opened under its name. We were ready. Sal and I sat in my study, the computer screen glowing in the dark room. We were about to take the first real step. I was going to wire a significant chunk of my retirement savings, my life's nest egg, into this new anonymous entity. It was the point of no return. Sal looked at me, his face serious. He said, Hank, are you sure about this? This is everything. If that stock goes to zero, it's all gone. This isn't a game. I looked out the window at the glowing blue and silver sign across the street. I thought about Mrs. Gable, about Tom Peterson, about the word fossil. I thought about my 40 years of honest work. I said some things are more important than money. Sal, and besides, it's not a game. It's a hostile takeover. Let's buy some stock. We started small, buying blocks of a few thousand shares at a time. The stock was so cheap we could acquire a significant number without even making a ripple in the market. Every morning, I'd wake up and check the stock price. Most days it was down, and every day I would smile. Let it fall. Let it get cheaper. We kept buying. The more it dropped, the more of Chase's parent company I owned. He was busy trying to tear down my old brick building, never realizing I was quietly buying the skyscraper he lived in, one brick at a time. The first month was a masterclass in patience. Sal and I had a system. We'd watch the trading volume on Apex Automotive stock. On days with high volume, when institutional investors were dumping their shares, we'd wade in and buy, our small purchases getting lost in the noise. On quiet days, we'd lay low. Sal set up alerts, so we knew whenever a new SEC filing was released, or a negative analyst report came out. Each piece of bad news was good news for us. It pushed the price down, making our war chest stretch further. I transferred more of my retirement funds into the H&S Holdings account. It was the biggest gamble of my life, a bet made not at a poker table, but in the quiet of my study, with my entire future on the line. But it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like an investment in justice. Meanwhile, across the street, Chase was growing more and more agitated. His plan to use the city to condemn my building had hit a snag. I'd hired a good, aggressive lawyer on Sal's recommendation, who buried the planning department in paperwork. He filed appeals, requested historical building assessments, and pointed out that all of the anonymous complaints had originated from a single IP address, which just so happened to be registered to Prestige Auto. The city, not wanting to get caught in a personal vendetta, backed off, scheduling a full review for 6 months down the road. This delay drove Chase insane. He saw me as the sole reason his grand vision was stalled. He couldn't comprehend that I wasn't playing his game. He'd redouble his efforts in other ways. He started a whisper campaign, telling suppliers that my old property was infested with rats, that the ground was contaminated with oil. He was trying to make the property toxic, so that even if I wanted to, I couldn't lease it to anyone else after Leo's term was up. Leo, bless his heart, put a big professionally made sign in his window, proudly operating from a historic town landmark. Not for sale. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt like a major victory. Chase couldn't stand being thwarted. His arrogance didn't allow for setbacks. He started making mistakes. He was so focused on me, on the physical property across the street, that he was neglecting his own business. The online reviews for Prestige Auto started to turn ugly. 1-star ratings piled up, telling stories of price gouging, shoddy repairs, and rude service. They replaced my alternator, and my car broke down 2 miles down the road. Quoted me $800. The final bill was $1,900, with a bunch of fees they never mentioned. The manager, Chase, was condescending and dismissed my concerns. He was my best asset. His own behavior was fueling the narrative that would eventually be his undoing. Our stock purchases continued, a silent, steady drumbeat. After 3 months, H&S Holdings owned just under 2% of Apex Automotive. It was a significant stake, but not yet enough to make any real moves. We needed to get to 5%. That was the magic number. Once you own 5% of a public company, you have to file a Schedule 13D with the SEC, publicly declaring your position and your intentions. That would be our first shot across the bow. That would be the moment the silent takeover went loud. The pressure was immense. I'd wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the sheer scale of what I was doing washing over me. This wasn't fixing a carburetor. This was high-stakes corporate warfare. I was risking the comfortable, peaceful retirement I had worked my whole life to secure. Sal was my rock. He'd call me, not to talk strategy, but just to check in. He'd say, "How's the Mustang running, Hank? Seen the game last night?" He kept me grounded. He reminded me that there was a life outside of this obsession, but it was an obsession. I couldn't deny it. Every time I saw Chase's smug face, every time I heard another story of him ripping someone off, it just hardened my resolve. It wasn't about the money. It was about seeing that look of supreme confidence wiped off his face. It was about showing him what a fossil could do. One evening, Maria called me. Not a chance meeting at the store, but a direct call. She was crying. She said, "He fired me, Hank. He fired me." I asked her what happened. She'd been working on a vintage Porsche, a beautiful car, and the owner was a meticulous, wealthy collector. Chase had told her to use a cheap abrasive compound to buff it out to save time and money. Maria had refused. She told him it would ruin the original paint. She said, "You don't treat a classic like that." Chase had fired her on the spot, right in the middle of the shop floor. He told her, "It's a car, not the Mona Lisa. If you're too sentimental to do your job, you can leave." Sentimental. The same word he used on me. That was his problem. He saw craftsmanship as sentimentality. He saw integrity as a weakness. He saw people not as human beings, but as tools or obstacles. After I made sure Maria was okay, and promised to make some calls to get her a new job at a reputable shop, I hung up the phone. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I called Sal. I said, "It's time. Forget trickling in. Let's start buying in blocks. Let's accelerate." The next day we started buying with more aggression. The price had bottomed out, and a bit of good news about a potential debt restructuring had caused a small bump. We had to move faster before it recovered any further. My nest egg was now almost entirely converted into Apex Automotive stock. We were all in. 2 months later we crossed the threshold. Heach and Soldings now owned 5.1% of Apex Automotive Group. The trap was set. The next morning, as required by law, our lawyer filed the Schedule 13D. In the section marked Purpose of Transaction, he didn't write investment. He wrote, "The reporting person intends to engage in discussions with management and the board of directors regarding opportunities to enhance shareholder value, including but not limited to changes in management and strategic direction." It was the corporate equivalent of a declaration of war. Somewhere in a high-rise office building in another city, the CEO of Apex Automotive was having a very, very bad morning. And across the street, Chase was blissfully unaware, probably polishing his new Ferrari, never imagining that the old fossil he'd been tormenting for months now owned a bigger piece of his empire than he did. The silent part was over. Now it was time for the noise. The filing of the Schedule 13D was like dropping a boulder into a placid pond. The ripples spread instantly. Wall Street blogs and financial news sites, which had all but written off Apex Automotive, were suddenly buzzing. Mysterious activist investor takes 5% stake in troubled Apex Group. Heach and Soldings emerges, signals shakeup at auto franchise. The stock, which had been stagnant for months, suddenly jumped 10%. Ironically, my own actions were making my remaining purchases more expensive, but it was a necessary cost. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a race. Sal and I were glued to our screens. The board of Apex issued a terse press release. "We are aware of the filing and are committed to acting in the best interests of all our shareholders." Corporate speak for oh hell. They had no idea who H. and Soldings was. Our lawyer had set up the LLC in Delaware, the corporate equivalent of a black hole. It was a shield of perfect anonymity. They were fighting a ghost. And what about Chase? He remained gloriously, beautifully oblivious. His world was the 100-yard stretch of pavement between his showroom and my old shop. He didn't read the financial news. He didn't care about the corporate maneuverings of the parent company that held his leash. He was too busy being the king of his tiny self-made kingdom. His only concern was the stubborn old man who wouldn't sell him a piece of dirt. In fact, the news of the activist investor probably made him feel more secure. A shake-up at corporate? Good. Maybe the new bosses would give him a bigger budget for his expansion. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He actually ramped up his campaign against me. He saw the legal delays as a temporary nuisance. He must have figured if he just applied enough pressure, the old man would break. He tried a new tactic. He started offering absurdly high prices for basic services to anyone on my street. $10 oil changes, free tire rotations. He was trying to buy the loyalty of my neighbors, to isolate me, to make me feel like the lone holdout in a neighborhood that had embraced his glorious future. It backfired. My neighbors were not fools. They were people I'd known for 30 years. They'd take his free tire rotation, sure, but they'd do it while laughing with me about it over the fence later. They'd say, "Can you believe this guy, Hank? He thinks we're idiots." One afternoon, he caught me as I was getting my mail. He strode across the street, waving a piece of paper. It was a formal written offer for my property. Drawn up by his lawyer, the number was significant. It was almost double what the property was actually worth. He presented it to me with a flourish, like it was a royal decree. He said, "All right, Fossil, this is my final offer. Take it, or I'm going to make your life a living hell. I'm going to bury you in legal fees and code violations until this building of yours is nothing but a pile of rubble. It's your choice. Cash out or get crushed." I looked at the paper. I looked at his smug, triumphant face. He thought he had me cornered. He thought this was checkmate. All I could do was laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh, just a genuine bubbling up from the gut laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement. The look on his face was priceless. The confusion, the flicker of anger. He couldn't process it. Why was the peasant laughing at the king? I folded the offer sheet neatly and handed it back to him. I said, "Chase, this is a very generous offer, but I think you should be saving your money. From what I hear, Apex is in for a bit of a rough patch. You might need it." He narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about? What do you know about Apex?" I just shrugged. I read the papers. Seems like they've got a new, very aggressive investor. Someone who wants to make some big changes. Might even want to clean house. Get rid of underperforming assets. You know, just business. He stared at me for a long moment. A flicker of something, maybe the first tiny seed of doubt, in his eyes, but his arrogance won out. He snatched the paper back. He sneered, "You're bluffing. You're a nobody, an old mechanic. What do you know about business? You just signed your own death warrant, old man." He turned and stormed back to his glass palace. He didn't know it, but he was the one who was bluffing, holding a pair of twos while I was sitting on a royal flush. The panic hadn't set in for him yet, but on the 40th floor of Apex Tower in Chicago, it was reaching a fever pitch. We had continued buying. We were now at 8.7%, and we weren't the only ones. Our 13D filing had acted as blood in the water. Other activist funds, smelling weakness, had started circling, buying up shares as well. The company was officially in play. The exodus began not with a flood, but with a trickle. It started with Tom Peterson, the master mechanic Chase had fired. After I helped him get a job at another shop, the word got around the tight-knit community of good mechanics. Tom told everyone what had happened, how Chase valued salesmanship over skill. Soon, 2 more of Prestige's best technicians quit. They couldn't work for a man who didn't respect the craft. They went to smaller independent shops, the very kind of fossils Chase despised. He replaced them with younger, cheaper kids who knew how to work a computer diagnostic tool, but couldn't diagnose a problem by sound and feel, the way a real mechanic does. The quality of work at Prestige, which was already questionable, fell off a cliff. Then the customers started to leave. The initial shine of the new facility was wearing off, replaced by the grim reality of comeback jobs and inflated bills. Mrs. Gable, my old customer, had become something of a local activist. She told her entire bridge club about her experience, and they told their friends. The story of the $1,500 gas cap became a local legend. People who had been my customers for decades, who had been tempted by the flashy new option, started quietly coming back into the fold. Not to my shop, of course, but they'd see me at the hardware store and pull me aside. They'd say, "Hank, you were right about that guy. Can you recommend a good, honest place to get my brakes done?" I became an unofficial referral service for every decent independent mechanic in a 50-mile radius. Maria, The detailer Chase had fired landed on her feet at a high-end restoration garage. The owner knew her work and hired her on the spot. She was happier than I'd seen her in years. She told me that the owner of the vintage Porsche had found out what Chase had tried to make her do. He'd pulled his car out of Prestige so fast it left tire marks. Then he'd called every single member of his classic car club and told them never to set foot in Prestige Auto. The community, the very thing Chase had tried to manipulate and buy, was turning on him. He didn't understand that a community isn't a market. It's a network of relationships, built on trust and shared history, things he knew nothing about. The final desperate countermove from Chase was both pathetic and predictable. About a week before the annual shareholder meeting for Apex Automotive was scheduled, he served my tenant, Leo, with an eviction notice. He hadn't bought the property, of course, but he'd had his lawyer find a loophole in the original commercial lease I'd signed. A vague clause about business activities not being a public nuisance. He was claiming Leo's vinyl cutting machine was too loud, a nuisance to his high-end clientele. It was a flimsy, desperate gambit, designed to inflict maximum pain and pressure on me through a third party. Leo was devastated. I told him not to worry, that my lawyer would handle it. But seeing the distress on that young man's face was the last straw. The game was over. The time for quiet, behind-the-scenes maneuvering was done. The shareholder meeting was in 5 days. I had my proxy votes lined up. I had formed a quiet coalition with 2 other activist funds, who also wanted the current board and CEO out. Together, we controlled just over 34% of the voting shares. It was enough. It was more than enough to stage a coup. I booked a flight to Chicago for myself and Sal. It was time to meet the man who thought he could crush me. It was time to show the king that the fossil owned the castle. The morning of the shareholder meeting felt like the calm before a storm. Sal and I flew to Chicago. First class. I'd never flown first class in my life. It felt strange, all that space and free orange juice. Sal was like a kid in a candy store. I just stared out the window at the clouds, my mind focused. This wasn't a celebration. It was the end of a long, arduous job. The meeting was held in a sterile ballroom at a downtown hotel. It was filled with men in dark suits, all with the same anxious, tight-lipped expression. The CEO of Apex, a man named Robert Wexler, stood at a podium, trying to project an aura of calm confidence that nobody was buying. He droned on about navigating headwinds and strategic realignments. It was all meaningless corporate jargon. We sat in the back, 2 old men in simple sport coats, completely invisible. The real action wasn't happening in the room, but through the proxy votes that had already been cast. Our lawyer, a shark named Miller, sat near the front, holding the votes for H&S Holdings and our allies. When the time came for the vote on the new board of directors, our proposed slate versus theirs, it was a foregone conclusion. Miller just had to formalize it. The motion was called. The votes were tallied. The company secretary, a pale, nervous man, walked to the podium and handed Wexler a card. Wexler's face went white. He cleared his throat and announced, his voice cracking ever so slightly, that the new slate of directors proposed by the shareholder coalition had been approved. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. The king was dead. My first act as the leader of the new controlling interest was simple. I had Miller call for an immediate board meeting. In a small conference room off the main ballroom, I finally met Robert Wexler face to face. He looked at me and Sal, his eyes full of confusion. He said, "Who are you?" "I'm the man from H&S Holdings," I said. He was flabbergasted. He couldn't compute it. He was expecting a rival CEO, a corporate raider in a power suit. He got a retired mechanic from a small town he'd never heard of. I told him he had 2 options: resign immediately with a modest severance, or be fired for cause at the next meeting in 1 hour. My second act was to appoint an interim CEO, a turnaround specialist recommended by one of our coalition partners. My third act, the one I had been waiting for, was to pick up my phone and call Prestige Auto. The receptionist answered. I asked to speak to Chase. She put me on hold, the tinny sound of his own awful radio jingle playing in my ear. Finally, he picked up. He said, "Yeah, what is it?" His voice was clipped, annoyed. I said, "Chase, it's Hank, the fossil from across the street." There was a pause. Then he laughed that arrogant, barking laugh. He said, "What do you want, old man?" Calling to finally accept my offer. "I'm busy." "No, Chase," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm calling to inform you that as of an hour ago, the board of Apex Automotive has been replaced, and the new ownership has decided that your franchise agreement is being terminated, effective immediately, for conduct detrimental to the brand." The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. It was a vast, empty canyon of disbelief. I could almost hear the gears in his head grinding, smoking, trying to process what I'd said. Finally he stammered. What are you talking about? You're lying. You can't do that." "I'm not doing it, Chase. I already did it. I own the company now." More silence. Then a sputtering, incoherent rage. You can't. Who are you?" "I'm the fossil, Chase. The one you tried to crush. I have a suggestion for you. I'd start packing up your personal belongings. The new management team will be on site tomorrow to begin liquidation. I'm buying back the land. Your dealership is on. I just approved the sale myself. I'm getting it for a very, very good price." And then I hung up. A week later I was back home. I stood on my porch, drinking my morning coffee. Across the street, a crew was taking down the big obnoxious Prestige Auto sign. The glass and chrome building looked hollow, empty. Chase was gone. He'd cleared out his office in the middle of the night. The stories around town were already becoming legend. No one had seen him. He'd just vanished, his empire collapsing into dust. I walked across the street and stood in the empty showroom. It was cold and sterile, with no soul. My old shop, solid and unassuming, stood across the way, watching. I had a choice to make. I could sell the whole thing, the land, the building, and walk away with a fortune that would make my retirement fund look like pocket change. I could have retired to a private island, but that was never the point. It was never just about the money. Instead, I called Tom Peterson. I called Maria. I called the other two mechanics. Chase had fired. I met them in the empty showroom of what used to be Prestige Auto. I told them my plan. We were going to reopen. We were going to gut the soulless, flashy building and build a real auto shop inside it. The best equipped, most advanced shop in the state, but one run on old-fashioned principles. Honesty, craftsmanship, respect. We were going to call it Hank's Legacy Auto, not because it was mine, but because it belonged to the ideal of what a business should be. Their faces lit up. It was a homecoming. The moral of this story: I guess there are a few. Maybe it's that you should never judge a book by its cover, or a man by his age. Maybe it's that arrogance is a blindfold, and true strength is often quiet and patient. Chase saw an old building, and an old man. He didn't see the foundation, and he didn't see the 40 years of goodwill I had built into the very soil of this town. He thought his empire was made of glass and steel, but it was really made of debt and disrespect. It was a house of cards, and all it took was one puff of wind from an old fossil to blow it all down. He treated me like I was a part of the past, something to be cleared away. What he failed to understand is that the past is what the future is built on. You can't have one without the other. You ignore it at your peril. He learned that lesson the hard way, so if you're out there and you feel like the world is passing you by, like the young guns with their fancy suits and their slick talk are making you obsolete, just remember this old mechanic. Remember that substance always outlasts flash. and that sometimes the most powerful move you can make is the one nobody sees coming. It wasn't about revenge until it was, and I have to admit, seeing that sign come down, letter by letter, felt pretty damn good. It felt like justice. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gives you something to think about. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, share your own story in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from folks who prove that you're never too old to stand your ground.